Hey, this is Joe with Grow It Build It, and today we're going to talk about brown-eyed Susan. One of the more common flowers you may encounter along roadsides, forests, stream banks, or even in people's yards is brown-eyed Susan. This short-lived plant looks very familiar to the ubiquitous black-eyed Susan, and while at a glance they do look similar, brown-eyed Susan does have the potential to be just as, if not more showy than black-eyed Susan. But there are some key differences that I'll cover in this video, but I'm going to be making a complete profile on this plant, including the following. What is brown-eyed Susan and its pros and cons? Identification and growing conditions, how to grow it from seed and save the seed, wildlife and garden uses, and then we will review. So let's take a closer look at this beautiful plant. So what is brown-eyed Susan? Well, brown-eyed Susan is a short-lived perennial or annual native to eastern North America. Scientifically known as Rudbeckia Triloba, it typically grows 3 to 5 feet tall in full sun and well-draining soil. Blooming dozens of yellow daisy-like flowers for up to 2 months, it will feed over 100 different species of bee and butterfly with nectar and pollen. Pros and cons. Some of the benefits it can bring are the beauty of its flowers by themselves. A single plant in the open can make hundreds of blooms on one plant. One specimen alone can really be a showstopper. It really is this showy. And complementing that is its long bloom time. It lasts for up to 2 months, with a super bloom of 4 weeks or so, if you will. And I really can't say enough about how showy this can be in the right setting. Now, another benefit of this is that you can use these branches in a cut flower arrangement. The long bloom time make it a good choice for that. And all these blooms will feed pollinators, attracting them to your yard. So we're going to go to cons. There are 2 cons that we need to talk about with brown-eyed Susan. The first being its short life. In general, this plant is an annual or a biennial, so you will need to plan on growing it every year or rely on self-seeding. The second con, which is by far the bigger one, is its propensity to self-seed in the right setting. In a formal mulched flower bed, this plant can take over. I first grew this plant back in like 2013 or 2014 timeframe, and I was thrilled with how many blooms it produced. But in a mulch flower bed, if not deadheaded, it will self-seed like crazy. You will be pulling hundreds and hundreds of seedlings next year. Identification. So the stems are green to red and have white hairs on them that are fairly conspicuous, and it'll branch frequently. The upper leaves are lanceolate to ovate like a spearhead, and up to 4 inches long by half as wide with coarsely serrated margins. But the biggest identification characteristic of this plant is that its lower leaves will be tri-lobed. If you see a plant with flowers that look like this and you notice that some of the lower leaves are tri-lobed, then it's a good chance that you've got brown-eyed Susan. There are a few differences with the ubiquitous black-eyed Susan that we should cover. So brown-eyed Susan will look a bit bushy and almost shrub-like at maturity compared to black-eyed Susan's more single stem or just a few branches. And you should see numerous smaller yellow daisy-like flowers on brown-eyed Susan. They're going to be a little tinier. So here's a good visual. This is brown-eyed Susan bloom next to a black-eyed Susan bloom. So brown-eyed Susan flowers will be 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter, contrasted with black-eyed Susans, which are closer to 3 inches diameter. Okay, I'm about to go into the growing conditions, but I just wanted to say that all this info plus more is at an article at my website that I will link to below. And if you are finding this video helpful, please click the like button, as it's really an easy way to help me out, and I do greatly appreciate it. Growing conditions. So for growing conditions, brown-eyed Susan prefers full sun, which is at least 6 hours per day, but can tolerate part sun, which is 4 to 6 hours per day. It likes moist to medium moist soil, and it should be well draining. Now, the final size and showiness of this plant will really be determined by its growing conditions. For instance, look at this specimen that is growing in partially open woods with lots of competition. It isn't that showy, and it's only like 2 feet tall. Contrast that with this one in my backyard microprairie that receives something like 10 hours of sun per day. It's about 6 foot tall. And have a look at this one, which is the first one I ever grew like 10 years ago. It topped out at 8 feet tall, no lie. And this 8 foot tall one isn't some special genetic freak, but more a product of good growing conditions, low competition, and fertile soil. How to save seed. So saving seed from brown-eyed Susan is relatively straightforward, and it's basically the same as black-eyed Susan. About a month after blooming, go cut off some seed heads when they start to turn gray and brown. Place them into a brown paper bag for a week, shake them up. There's some other tricks that I can show you in a detailed video on separating the chaff from the seed. on black-eyed Susans, which I'll link to below. You can do the same process for brown-eyed Susan. How to grow it from seed. So it's pretty straightforward to grow brown-eyed Susan from seed. The only thing to note is that the seed has a dormancy mechanism that will prevent germination. You have to overcome that by cold moist stratifying it in the fridge or winter sowing it for like 30 days. I have a video on cold stratifying in the fridge and winter sowing that I'll link to below. For direct sowing, you could just scatter the seed on disturbed soil like in really early spring and walk on it. It just needs good contact with the soil. But for sowing stratified seed or winter sowing in containers, just press them in firm for a planting depth. They don't need to really be covered at all. Place a container in a location that gets morning sun and afternoon shade, and you will be good to go. This is what the seedlings look like shortly after germination. And once your seedlings get several sets of true leaves, you can separate the seedlings or plant them in their final location. Wildlife and garden uses. So when it comes to wildlife, there have been over 120 species of bees, wasps, pollinating flies, and moths that have been observed on brown-eyed Susan. There is also a few moth caterpillars who will feed on this plant. The numerous flowers that it creates also creates copious amounts of seed that will also feed smaller birds like finches. And finally, deer and rabbits will browse the foliage, although it isn't really that preferred. You can always protect it with liquid fence if you are inclined. Landscaping. So I have a large amount of experience with this flower in the garden, both good and bad. So while it looks absolutely great in a low competition environment, you have to be prepared to deal with self-seeding. You can try to deadhead the plant, and heck, I do that even in my wildflower area, but my preference is to just let it flourish in the more wild areas with heavier competition and less sun. So here's an example of it in the woods behind my yard, and here's other examples of it in the woods where it's growing just fine. This allows the plant to grow, look good and propagate, but prevents it from taking over an area. What's kind of interesting and goes against all the references is that I know a patch of forest where this plant grows in what would seem to be far too shady of an area for it, but it does fine and it only gets, maybe 2 feet tall there. It serves the insect community well, and it looks great while doing so. But all right, time to review. Brown-eyed Susan is a short-lived flower that produces tons of blooms for up to 2 months in a season. It typically grows 3 to 5 feet tall, but can go far above or below these heights depending on the growing conditions. And the preferred conditions is full sun to part sun and moist to medium moist soil that drains. It looks absolutely stunning with its hundreds of blooms and will feed a huge number of pollinators, although some of those aren't as conspicuous as the pollinators of the Rudbeckia genus seem to be just very tiny. It's not always giant butterflies and giant bumblebees. But you can absolutely use this plant in the garden. Just be prepared to deadhead it to prevent the massive amount of self-seeding that is possible and has happened in my experience. But that's all the info I have for you today. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you have questions, ask them in the comments below. I will do my best to answer them. But all right, you guys all have a good day.